always found organically what the metaphor, again, that word, for a show was. If it's company, it's about steel. It's about linear, almost Mondrian configurations. New York was about elevators, so he surprised me and put an elevator in. Cabaret was about tawdry colors against black backdrops. That would describe George Gross's drawings pretty eloquently, and so much of the Feininger and so much of the German expressionist stuff. He was infinitely interesting, unbelievably impatient, not just with you, but with himself. And so we would spend 6 months talking about everything before he put one line to paper. He was more, it seemed to me, interested in the senses which are not visual. We would talk about smell and taste and sound. And somehow, miraculously, those other senses made their way into his visual designs. Most stimulating man I ever worked with.
Good evening. Tonight we're continuing our program series honoring Harold Prince. We're still also grieving the loss of Harold Prince from this summer. So I've been trying to let him introduce this series as much as I can with the incredible treasure trove of videos of interviews we have with him that are located right here at this library. There's a beautiful exhibition on the first floor, which I also invite you to visit if you haven't yet. It's a gorgeous tribute to him, one that he participated in helping to create. And our special guest tonight also participated in helping to create that exhibit, so I'm very honored to have Marc Aronoson here tonight. In Mr. Prince's biography, he said that he considered the day that he met Boris Aronoson to be second only to the day he met George Abbott. George Abbott, of course, was his mentor, this person that helped him get his start. I think it's interesting he didn't say Sondheim, he didn't say Kander and Ebb, he didn't say Sheldon Harnick or Jerry Bach. He said Boris Aronoson was that day he met Boris Aronoson was the second most important day. And you can see that in the exhibit, what an incredible dynamic collaboration these two people had. And in fact, tonight we're gonna realize it was more than just these two people. I wanna tell you a little bit about Marc. He's a member of this library family, in my opinion. We're very honored to have him back here. He has a doctorate in history from NYU, and he's a full-time faculty member at Rutgers University. They're lucky to have him there. He's the author and co-author of more than 25 books, so he's a good library guy. He knows a lot about Fiddler on the Roof. He was a featured speaker in Fiddler on the documentary. Maybe some of you saw it, called Fiddler Miracles. He's been working on an exhibit, which I would like to see, called City Game, A History of Basketball in New York. He's been working on that with his son, Sasha, so that seems like a nice collaboration. He's here today. Sasha's here somewhere back there, maybe helping with the camera. And he's also, it's a family business here, co-author with Marina Budhos, I hope I'm saying that right, forgive me, working on a TV adaptation for their book, which they wrote together, called Eyes of the World, Robert Capa, Gerda Taro, and the Invention of Modern Photojournalism. And he has another book coming out. You guys should keep an eye out for 2021, his newest book, Crush, A History of New York City in 4 Streets and a Square. So we're very, very honored to have Marc Aronoson here. Please give him a warm library welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Evan. And I have to thank Doug Reside, who couldn't be here tonight, but who really created the exhibit upstairs, which is just marvelous, and I hope you all do get to see it. I feel like after watching Hal, I have nothing to say. I feel like he said much of what I was going to say. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of information about my father and his artistic lineage, but also my mother and her artistic lineage and how they work together. And I've called this a marriage of two modernisms because while they work very closely together, and I think you'll actually hear and see that and learn more about that, they came from two related but distinct strands of modernism. And I think there's something interesting to see beyond them as individuals to the lineages they came from and how that worked together in the theater they created. So here at the library, you'll see some of the sets that you perhaps know of that my parents created. And there's the book that my mother wrote with Frank Rich, which they together called The Theater Art of Boris Aronson. It's interesting that she chose to frame it that way. So what I'm going to explore is his lineage, hers, and their collaboration. So he was born in 1898, just outside of Kiev, and his father was a rabbi, an important rabbi in Kiev. But what was interesting about Solomon was that while he was completely devout and important within the Jewish community, he was very interested also in being modern. He made sure that all of his 10 children learned Russian as well as Yiddish and Hebrew. He sent one of his daughters off to Switzerland to be educated. And he was very importantly involved in the case of Menachem Mendel Beilis, which was written by Malamud in The Fixer. As you may recall, this was the last instance of a blood libel case. And this is a case where a Jew was accused of using the blood of a Christian child in making Passover matzah. But the point of the blood libel case is it wasn't a claim that Beilis was a psychotic individual. It was a claim that Jews needed to do this, that this was a part of actual Jewish ritual. So what was interesting about the Beilis case is that my grandfather, as one of the leaders of the Jewish community, decided to fight this in court, decided to take the Tsar, which was promulgating this kind of anti-Semitic propaganda, to court. In a way, it was like the civil rights movement saying to America, these are your laws, live by them. And so this was kind of an aspect of my grandfather's modernity. They actually won the case. They won the case that this was not a part of Jewish practice. And then my grandfather encouraged Beilis to move to Palestine. My grandfather was a very active Zionist. And that, in fact, put him at odds with other Orthodox rabbis who were against the idea of creating a state of Israel. They wanted only the Messiah to bring Jews to the state of Israel. So he was slightly at odds with his fellow rabbis in his Zionism. And but he had 10 children, and he also had a court around him of acolytes, people studying with him. And so my father's memory, the only description he ever gave me of his mother was of her being sort of red-faced and exhausted, carrying the laundry for all the kids. And he was neither the youngest nor the eldest. He was sort of young middle, and so he always felt sort of ignored and out of place. And he wrote a letter to my mother in which he said, "Nature made me a conjure, Konjur. That's what they used to call me at home when I was a kid. Conjure means, I imagine, a person who always complains, dissatisfied, a man who suffers quickly, a nudnik." That's what he said. And I'm not totally sure of what word he meant. He probably was phonetically capturing a word in Yiddish. But I think he also meant something like a conjurer, a person who is dissatisfied with things as they are and wants to make them into something else. And that was always true of my father. And he would put on these Purim plays for the family, but always with a bit of cruelty. He would have one of his older brothers stand up on a stepladder with his hand in the air and just leave him there. So there was a degree of revenge, but there was also a degree in which even that theatricality and theater became his family. He would not join the ritual of his father in observant Judaism. He found his family and his ritual in theater. And he did indeed, as Hal said, study with Alexandra Exter. And what's really interesting, if you look at this Exter set, is that this is classic constructivism, but the set is a kind of engine. The designer is not decorating a space, but is in effect kind of creating the play, the space that makes the play possible. In one way, the set expresses the essence of the play, but it also defines the space in which it's enacted and then comes alive with people. One way designers sometimes do this is with a set that resembles a boxing ring or a tennis court or a basketball court. And that's true, but that's very passive. And in this vision, you're creating the jungle gym, you're creating the field, but it's also an aesthetic creation. It's also a narrative creation. It's not just a space. But this is the world my father entered theatrically. And now I have to take you on a slight excursion into something that hasn't been spoken about as much about my father. And let me begin with a little bit of art history. You know, if you think of Western art and you think of sort of the glories and achievements of Western culture as it was understood, some part of that is perspective, some part of that is a certain kind of realism, and a sort of sense of arrival in the greatness of Western civilization as expressed in certain kinds of art. But in the early 20th century, that's totally subverted. That's subverted by painters who are finding the essence of the modern in what might have been seen as primitive, and who are finding the very kind of two-dimensional linear quality of what, again, might be called primitive art as the essence of what they're seeing as modern art. And there's a wonderful example of this. When the Armory Show opened in New York, which brought Picasso and Branc and other of these new artists to America, Teddy Roosevelt came to the show and said, "I have on my wall a Navajo rug, which is better than all of this art." And of course, he was completely got it. From the point of view of these modernists, the Navajos were modern, and this kind of abstractness was the modern, not only aesthetically in terms of what it depicted, but if you think of the age of Freud, the age of Marx, the age of Darwin, questioning that whole structure of civilization and what was advancement, what was modernity. So my father was involved in a movement in Russia. He was one of the leaders of this movement called the Culture League. Oh, I should mention, in Russia, there was this idea of the modern. Malevich famously was involved in what he called suprematism. And as you see, he put his square in this suprematist exhibit in the place that an icon should go. So the idea that the modern was the new religion. It was as powerful as an icon should be. So my father was involved in this thing called the Culture League. And this was an idea in the 19th century. Nationalism, the way Germany became a country or Italy became a country, was the idea that you have a people, a language, a folklore, a land, a nation. So what did this mean for Jews? Well, for my grandfather, it meant Zionism. Palestine answered that. But for the members of the Culture League, the idea of a Jewish nation and a Jewish identity came in abstraction and Yiddish. And they, just like the Parisians, looked for primitive art, two-dimensional Jewish art. They went to ancient synagogues. They did grave rubbings. They did children's books. They were looking for the Jewish equivalent of the way the African art allowed the French to subvert and create a new modern that overturned civilization as it had been seen. So this is Rybak, who, with my father, wrote the manifesto for this. This is Lasitsky, El Lasitsky. This is a Haggadah of his. This is Chagall, who, if you again, Chagall is in his surrealist evocation, his dreamy evocations, is this same looking for what is this modern and Jewish identity. And this is a children's book my father worked on, all in the same period of sort of trying to find the modern and to find a Jewish identity in this abstraction in the Culture League. And so my father left, went to Berlin, went to Paris. Oh, the other thing is my grandfather went to Palestine with 6 of his kids, and most of the family went there. My father could not. He was a Zionist, but he did not want to be in a provincial backwater. He went to Berlin, he went to Paris, he wrote this book about Chagall, he made enough money, he came to New York. He wanted to be in the modern. He wanted to be in, as Hal said, the place of elevators and zippers and skyscrapers and machines and the new and art. And so that's the path he followed, having created this book. And so here's an early sketch. And when he came to New York, he worked in the Yiddish theater. That was the language he spoke. But he did not work in the popular, very nostalgic Yiddish theater on 2nd Avenue. He would tell very funny, good jokes about that theater. He worked up in the Bronx at an avant-garde Yiddish theater. And in the Yiddish theater, some of the plays, he is listed as the director. And that's not because he sat on a seat like this and told actors to find their mark. It's because the design, like with Exeter, shaped the play. The design created the space of the play and was so determining that he was listed as the director. This is a costume sketch he did. And this is the most famous play he did there. It was called The 10th Commandment. And this is, the 10th Commandment depicts heaven and hell. This is hell. Hell is the human mind. And here you can see how, again, it creates the space that defines the action. So that's what my father did there. When I was a teenager and it was the 60s and the Living Theater came and there were naked actors running around, he took me to the Living Theater and he said, "Looks like my set for the 10th Commandment." The other thing I should say about the 10th Commandment, it opened the Yiddish Art Theater on 2nd Avenue and 10th Street, Maurice Schwartz's new theater. And let me just say that when they reached 2 in the morning, the first act finished. The play did not last. And my father moved on, designing sets for Radio City Music Hall. And again, he loved the machines of New York. He loved the physicality of New York and the engines of New York. And then he moved on to Broadway. Broadway, here it's the group theater, but which at this moment was very naturalistic, was the opposite of all of that experimentation. Here he is working with Odette's. Awake and Sing is not going to be done in a jungle gym, although any of you directors, try it. So that is sort of the initial lineage I want to give you of my father, because we now have him working on Broadway. To tell you about my mother, I should say I'm going to talk about the Yalovitz-Groag link. In part, her parents were first cousins, but which was not so unusual in Jewish families. It was true of Marina's grandparents, but maternal grandparents, but it was also, they were very close. And they were part of this world of German-speaking Czech Jews who had sort of gone into industry. They had the part of the family that were brewers. It was a very modern brewery, all full of machines and figuring out how to scientifically brew beer. one of the people was the first person to bring saccharin to Vienna. And so there was a kind of modernity and wealth through these new possibilities. And then the next generation, the generation of her parents, were the children of these modernizing Jews who were not observant, as Freud spoke of himself as a godless Jew. And I think that was sort of where Heinrich, my grandfather, was, in the same place. And so Heinrich was trained as a conductor. He got his PhD studying Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, but he became very close to and enamored of Schoenberg. And he was in the circle of Schoenberg. This is the Schoenberg family, as portrayed by Richard Gerstel. And if you recall the story, Schoenberg had no money, and he thought maybe he could make some money painting. So he invited Gerstel, who had this interesting style, to come live with him and his wife. It was 1906. But in 1908, Schoenberg discovered that Gerstel and his wife were having an affair. So I'll pause there for a second to say that Gerstel painted the entire Schoenberg circle, including my grandfather. I say Heinrich-ish because the actual painting by Gerstel is missing, but is said to have looked quite like this. We even thought it might be this, but apparently it isn't. So Schoenberg's wife has this affair with Gerstel. Schoenberg catches them together. His wife even tries to run off and be with Gerstel. Schoenberg banishes Gerstel from this intense world of Webern and Berg, and my grandfather, who were working and sort of trying to invent the modern in music. And when the affair is exposed, Gerstel kills himself quite dramatically. And at that moment, Schoenberg composes a piece, his second string quartet. It's called the String Quartet, but it includes singing, to a poem by Stefan George. It's a poem of sort of loss about a 16-year-old boy who had died. And so I breathe the air of another planet. Schoenberg is announcing, it's the words of the poem, but he's announcing something. And about a minute later in the piece, he breaks tonality. He breaks the trajectory of Western music as much as the Parisian painters and Exter and the designers have broken Western art. And he said, as you see, at this point, he is saying, I'm completely liberating music from anything it's been before. And this is the world that Heinrich is working in as the conductor who brings this new music to the world. You see, obviously, the influence of Freud in the second quotation. I tend not to read quotations. So then, Jacques Groag, who was Heinrich's brother-in-law and uncle, because of the relation, is an architect and builder who is deeply influenced by Adolf Loos. And Adolf Loos, this is the Hofburg Palace, and directly facing this Baroque wonder, he builds this building. And Adolf Loos says speaks about decoration. Well, I'll get to Wittgenstein in a second. Let me just, he says, the evolution of culture marches with the elimination of ornament from useful objects. So Luce is destroying decoration in the same way as Schoenberg is breaking music. But Luce is an architect, very, very influential, but he doesn't always want to build the actual buildings. This is given to other people. And one of his close collaborators, a guy named Peter Engelmann, is invited by Ludwig Wittgenstein to build the Wittgenstein house. But Engelmann gets so caught up in Wittgenstein's philosophy that he stops working on the house, and Jacques Groag, the builder contractor, takes over. And so we now see Wittgenstein has put an end to philosophy in the same way that Luce has put an end to decoration, and Schoenberg has put an end to tonalist music. And so what Jacques says, I have a quote, he is actually, I should get to this. I guess I'm missing a slide. Jacques finds Schoenberg drives him crazy. I'm not Schoenberg, Wittgenstein drives him crazy. Because Wittgenstein decides after the house is built that it must have perfect proportions. So the ceiling must be raised a half an inch to meet this. And he's the builder. Wittgenstein is infinitely rich, so he can do it. But Jacques actually has to create it. And what I'm getting at there a little bit is that Heinrich was very, very close to Schoenberg and Webern and Berg, but he was the conductor. He wasn't the genius challenging all music. He was the person bringing this music to the world. Jacques Groag loved Luce, was a disciple of his, but he actually had to build the building and did not want to be stuck with raising ceilings, a half an inch. So what I'm getting at in mentioning Vienna, if you go back to 1908 and on, you had this grand empire that was on the one hand flowering and the other hand decaying and then disappearing after World War I. And I think these three, Wittgenstein, Luce, and Schoenberg, it's all this sense of supplanting, all this sense of the old gone, completely replaced by the new, that will dispense with any of that and take us into this utopia of the completely different. I think for the Jalowitz-Groags, they were very drawn to these geniuses, but they also had to be in the world. They couldn't just be in theory. They had to build, they had to conduct, they had to find audience. They realized the visions of the great men in practical terms. There's a Jewish angle to this. Schoenberg, like Mahler, converted. Mahler converted sort of for practical reasons. Schoenberg, they didn't want to be tied down in Jewishness. They wanted to be in this freed modernity where this identity no longer held you back, but he converted back again with the rise of the Nazis. So there's Heinrich. It's not a very great photo, but this is sort of how I see him in relation to them. Oh, this is Jacques' comment about building the Wittgenstein house. And on the left is the Wittgenstein house, and on the right were the kind of homes Jacques was building for these Jewish families in their home, which was called Olomouc, which is about an hour outside of Prague. And then there's my aunt, Lisa's sister, Truda, who was a weaver, who studied in the Bauhaus and studied, that was her artistic trajectory. So here's Lisa. She's young. And she was a student of set design, and she was in high school. These are her high school sets that she did, actual professional sets for Max Reinhardt. And the thing about her that I think you see in these sets is while her family is completely embracing the new, she's also trained in the existent and the old. She's completely familiar in both worlds. She actually is in Vienna at the moment of the Anschluss. She could have been trapped in Vienna, very likely would have been trapped in Vienna. Much of her family went to Terezin, some of whom survived. But Heinrich came to Black Mountain College to head the music department there. And because he was there and was teaching there, Johanna actually taught there, Lisa's mother. Trude came to teach there after the war. This is called the Olowitz House. It was built by the students at Black Mountain. And Lisa came there. And I think, and there's Mary Emma Harris is here, who is the great expert on Black Mountain, and she can tell me if I'm right. But it seemed to me that in Vienna, these geniuses were reducing art to essence, but they were also fighting against an existing art. Whereas in Black Mountain, you have Albers reduces painting to color, Annie Albers to pattern, Buckminster Fuller to the triangle, but they're like carpenters who take an element, they feel the heft and texture of an element like wood, and they can play with it with wit. So there's Albers with color. There's Annie Albers. And Buckminster Fuller. This is a sequence of photos taken by Trude as the Black Mountain College students decide to build a geodesic dome. But the thing about Black Mountain at this moment is they have no money, and the only tools they have are Venetian blinds. And the Venetian blinds are not strong enough, so this geodesic dome did not stand. Next year's did. But again, you see, I think to me in Black Mountain, that severity more becomes carpentry and wit instead of this kind of declaration of triumph and supplanting. And this worked, this same sense of wit came with my mother and her father, because while in Europe he was conducting in the same halls that Beethoven had conducted in, or Brahms, to audiences that knew every note of every great piece, in America he was having to play magic flute records to students who had never heard it. So what he did is he played magic flute and asked my mother to illustrate every scene of it. So to me, this is this sort of freedom and wit and charm that they could have, and that she actually did the whole opera this way. And here she is doing a play. That's John Styx she's working with. So let's go back to Broadway. Boris is in Broadway with his Bohemian friends. This is Don Freeman's drawing of Al Hirschfeld. This is Don's drawing of Boris, and Al's drawing of Boris. So they were the buddies, you know, around town at every store, at every show, seeing everything in town. And she comes to New York, and she falls in love with his art, and then with him. She worked as his assistant, and there's the sketch she did of their marriage, and of them working in, this was in Columbus Circle. They had an apartment, and if you look closely at it, you can see they're each doing their own work. He, you know, he was an Eastern European Jew. She was very much from a Germanic Jewish family, which did not often accept Eastern European Jews, but they accepted him because he was an artist. You know, art was the family religion, really, on both sides, and I think they found a family bond in that. I think she was also drawn to my father's evident Jewishness. There was a kind of grounding in how clearly Jewish he was. And there's a letter he wrote her in 1951. He had a Guggenheim. He was traveling around Europe. And he was in Austria, which was at the time still run by the Soviets. And it happened to be May 1st. And he said, I wasn't on the streets on a May Day for God knows how many years. Was very moved with the old curtain in the Staatsopera. It so reminded me of my youth. I like it here, but to find a Jew, I have to look in the mirror. And I think that sense of Jewishness was something that meant something to my mother. And so there's this sense of sort of playful excitement they're having in working together. And so now I'm going to ask my wife, Marina, to come up, because in preparing for this, we found letters of theirs that I think will be useful to give a sense of how they worked together, how they brought their different backgrounds and skills together. 1958 was an important year. My father had to go to Israel for some family business, which also meant he would stop, as is his wont, in London and in Paris. He later went on to Athens. And that meant there were a lot of letters between them exchanged as he was traveling and she was at home. And they were talking a lot about their work. This first letter that Marina is going to read, we're not certain of the date, but there's one thing in it that tells us it must have been after 1956, and I suspect it is from 1958. So do you want to, this is a show they're working on.
You don't want to name the show? Okay, you're going to make it a surprise. Okay. Boris, watch the proportions of the sets. Characteristic Dutch is narrow and tall, more like the photo, you have it, of the London production. The view out of Pete's room through and past the skylight would be the photos that show roofs, passage roof in the foreground, and western of foreign, the church tower. Something like you have the photos in his room on the side.
So they had gone, oh, I should show you this. This is the photo you'll see upstairs of them working together. And I want to tell you something about this. You see how my father's explaining something? When you see photos of him, he's always seeming to be coming from somewhere else. Sort of explain, that's that conjurer sense. He's coming from a distance and having to explain. And she's very focused.
She's very direct.
And there's a sequence showing that. And they did go to Amsterdam and had these photos. And this is what Marina just read to you.
So this was for the set for Anne Frank, and one of the additional things that's really interesting about this is that when Lisa essentially escaped Vienna, she escaped and lived in Holland. So she's bringing her familiarity with the Netherlands to this play. And her sister, Trude, who you heard mentioned, lived in open hiding throughout the entire war, and her husband was in the underground. So Anne Frank and the story of Anne Frank is something that Lisa was very steeped in, and she lived there for a few years before she came to America. So this very direct information about what the set should look like came from her. Do you want me to read the other? Yeah. Let's see, what else does she have to say? Note, skylight in Peter's room and somewhat lower window and passageway face the inner court. Note the winding stairs into the main house. That is the same as the actual plan of the house. See the book, the diary. Note, actual windows facing the gardens in the back. One from Anne's room, maybe. One boarded up, one in a space between her room and the WC. Little window in the main room.
So she is defining for him what the set needs to look like. The next play, again, I don't want to show you the set first, but my mother got a script, and she read it carefully. She kept trying to get the script to my father, who was hither and yon. This was the days where you would send things to American Express to go pick them up. And so she decides to give my father her reading of the script.
And I should say they wrote very extensively to each other during this period. I read the play, It's very strange. One has to no doubt read it several times. Very surrealistic, very theatrical. One ought to make a real show out of it. Find out from Gadge, who's Elia Kazan, among other things, if he plans any act breaks and where, so far not indicated. And I imagine the shadows are actually pantomime, acted out by other actors, not the ones speaking. It seems to be visually, it starts out quite realistic, gets more and more abstract as the play unfolds, and returns to reality at the end, similar yet different to the beginning. When he speaks of sky and space, I should think it's an abstracted space rather than a real one, not just emptiness. Read it and reread it, Boris. It's hard to grasp, but real theater and ought to be fun to do, though not a bit commercial. She then writes again about this same set. Seems to me that Carbu would be a great help. I wonder if I'm crazy. Seems to me that the idea of the tent is like the house of God, a church, in other words, and yet a tent. The upper platform is like a pulpit, the table at which Job eats, like the altar, or rather the symbol of it. In other words, I see it as a very religious play rather than the opposite. Of course, it also needs a certain circus-like sideshow area. What's the symbol of that? Maybe the showplace of the world, like a morality play. As you can see, my mind is buzzing, so relax, dear.
So my father writes, "Dear, I must pay you a compliment. The more productions I see, the more I begin to appreciate your talent for the theater. Your instincts are so right and theatrical." So that was Anne Frank. So if you want to see Anne Frank, and this is the play that she was writing about, Archibald MacLeish's J.B. And you see how much the set follows the ideas she had proposed. And what's fascinating is she did write this book with Frank Rich and worked very closely with him and gave him a tremendous amount of materials. And there's a great chapter about J.B. in the book in which she mentions not a word about her letter and her part in it. So she was very direct, but there was also a kind of invisibility that mattered to her. So I wanted to show you what I think their process was. So my father did a great many collages. These are not sketches for sets, but as I remember him, he would just go off and work all night, and he would create these collages, which to me look almost like there's a proscenium, and you're going deeper and deeper into that rectangle, into that space, and there's this palimpsest quality. You're always leaving the trace of what you had before as you go deeper, as an expression of what's there. You're not erasing it. You're adding to it. It always has texture. It always has depth. And you're always sort of searching for something. If you think of a theater, you have these two-dimensional and three-dimensional spaces. And it seems to me that was him. That was him, the conjurer, kind of going into space to find something, to find the essence of a play. And that's what he would do, is to try to come up with these images that would realize that essence. And that's what I see him working through in his collages. So in 1960, they did Do Re Mi. And Do Re Mi was always my favorite set of his. And it was a disaster. And it was a disaster because the set is absolutely gorgeous. And it was pop art. If you actually look in the book, there are homages to Stuart Davis, homages to Calder, homages to Clay, and the beginning of true pop art. You see, he used my Mad magazine, while even mentioning Kandinsky. So he really understood something. That reason I asked to put that in there is there was something really accurate about the play. The play was about corruption in the jukebox industry. This is 1960. 1959 was the moment when advertisers realized that the baby boom generation had hit teenage, and music shifted to the Brill Building, shifted to creating music for teenagers. And the way Broadway shows had worked, which is that you had a song like that, and that helped sell the show, didn't work anymore. So you had the hit song, but the play failed, and the sets completely overwhelmed the play. They were an art object. They weren't a realization of the play itself. And Hal really was very critical of my father. He wasn't involved in the show, but he gained a kind of negative image of my father because of how he did this play. So I showed my father's process. Now this is my mother's process. And if you see this kind of delicacy but intensity, there is this architectural precision, this kind of fierce clarity. She built a lot of the models for the plays. And to me, she is doing the same thing as the Yalovitz Groags. She's taking the vision of the creative, the person who goes into inner space and finds the new and realizes it and brings it to the world, gives it an architectural reality. And she did something else. She was a diplomat. My father was difficult. And, Hal was very nice in what he said, but my father could be very, very difficult. And my mother was a diplomat. And again, if you look at this photo of them talking to Hal, my father, again, is sort of coming from another space. He's a little threatened by her. What's she going to say? And she's clear. And this is Viennese diplomacy. This is Metternich. This is not Zaza Gabor. This is Metternich. And in this period after Doremi, where my father really wasn't getting shows, she had to work in this kind of diplomatic way. But my father continued making art, and he had an exhibit at the Storm King Arts Center, which showed sort of the history of his art, including the set for JB. And Jerry Robbins went to see it along with Sheldon Harnick and Jerry Bach, and he said to Sheldon of JB, "This is a perfect set because it's a perfect work of art, and yet it won't be complete until there are actors in it." And this is exactly, back to Exeter, back to the Yiddish theater, what my father was trying to create. This work of art that only became alive, that only became inhabited with people in it. And let me see, what am I not doing something? I think we need to advance the slide somehow. So Jerry convinced Hal that they should do Fiddler. And to me, from Fiddler on and the sequence of sets that you'll see there are the kind of bringing together of these two artistic trajectories and personalities. My father coming out of constructivism, the designer as director, but with a sense of audience, that you can't just impose a vision. Perhaps he did that in Doremi, but that you have to be with the play. And my mother's sense of these pure elements with a playful quality, realizing the vision in the world. Now, about collaboration. The way they collaborate, it's clear they worked intensely together. They were a team. In every playbill, in the smallest type possible, in the back, it would say, assistant to Boris Aronson, Lisa Yalovitz. And my mother never objected to that. She was not, the argument always was that he had had a career already. But as we saw with the JB chapter in the book she wrote, there was a kind of invisibility that in some ways was comforting for her, but she took on. And she had a choice after my father died. She had always wanted to do children's books. And she was close to Don Freeman. She was close to an illustrator not well known anymore these days, Kurt Worth. She could have done it. I went on to work in children's books, but she chose instead to write the book about my father. And in a way, you could say that was smart. His reputation, his fame, was worked. That helped her. But she chose against being visible. But I now want to show you that my idea of how their process might have worked with one example and then end with one play. So this is sort of photos, imagistic photos taken of the city. And this is the equivalent of those collages, searching for the essence of a play. This is now becoming drawings. Those sort of almost infrared groks of the city are now taking shape, are now taking form, are now being filled in and become the play. And that's sort of the process I saw in both of them. Even in a play, as you might seem, as stark as this. And that leads me to the very last. My father worked on Fidelio here at the Met and another opera which lasted one night or two, Morning Becomes Electra as an opera. But he got to know Otto Schenk, this Austrian opera director. And the very last project my father was working on is Otto Schenk asked him to do Moses and Aaron. And Moses and Aaron was the opera Schoenberg wrote, wrestling with Judaism. In Moses and Aaron, Moses speaks to God, but cannot speak to people. He is unintelligible. Aaron betrays God and Moses. He gives people the golden calf, but he understands human needs. He is the one who realizes the vision, just as in a way I saw the Yalovitz Groags doing that. And this is one of the only two images we have from the exploration of Moses and Aaron, which to me perfectly brings together these two lineages I've been talking about, the Viennese modernist, the Russian constructivist, that of my mother and that of my father. Thank you. As I always say, questions, comments, observations. Anything I can help you with, or Marina, because I have to say,